I want to say first thanks to everybody for being here for this. We've got a few guests who signed up for just the debate only, and welcome to you as well. This is a weekend-long conference for free thinkers, humanists, atheists, and other labels on the wall, and that you will find if you talk to some of the guests here. But we want to thank our guests for being here for the debate and for the entire weekend. I'm the co-founder of the Central Florida Free Thought Community, a local humanist community initially founded for the purposes of keeping religion and government separate. Before we start, I want to set the stage a bit. In 2013, one of the first and biggest issues we discovered as a chapter of the Freedom from Religion Foundation was a local church that was starting up and using local schools for Sunday services. Now, this practice is common locally and elsewhere, I suspect, as well, since schools and municipalities cannot discriminate against renters simply because they're religious. That's a legal debate for another day, though. So our local group learned of a church setting up in 3 schools in Orange and Seminole County. We had no legal concerns with their presence alone, but several lines were crossed. School administrators and others in government didn't exercise the discretion that they should have, and the fact is that it's not up to the house of worship or the pastor of the congregation to know the rules. That responsibility belongs to the government. We wish that those folks did know the rules, and we're happy to help them understand them better, but those relationships don't exist very often, but that's changing here in Central Florida. As I said, issues came up, lines were crossed, but we were able to address them with the school board, so we corrected the concerns, everyone involved was educated. Those issues aren't my point today, but it is important to note. I learned later that the goals of those 3 separate pastors may not have been completely aligned. So we're not going to talk about that too much today, but I learned that after I met one of them. And you'll hear more about that shortly. So that brings me to my first introduction. Andy, come up and say hello to everyone if you'd like. Andy, this is everyone. Everyone, this is Andy.
Hey, everybody.
So my friend Andy and I met. He is actually the pastor of one of those 3 churches. That church still exists in a different form that he has. And, you know, as you can imagine, a lot has been learned, mostly by the school board, but also by us due to our friendship. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and us today. It really means a lot to be here. With that introduction, you would understand that David and I developing a friendship got off to a difficult kind of start. And there are 2 things I need to say about that. First of all, I need to say sorry publicly to David and to some of you. In my naivety, there were lines of church and state that I crossed that I shouldn't have done, and that wasn't appropriate, and I'm sorry about that. Secondly, I want to say thank you for educating me on how we as a church should conduct ourselves. We are seeing in our world right now that the church and the state are getting into a lot of trouble as those boundaries are blurred. And David has been a clarifying factor for me, and I'm grateful for that. So, David, just say publicly, sorry, thank you. Second reason that I wanted to say thank you to David is that in this issue, David really helped me understand one of the reasons why I was doing what I was doing. And that was because in our schools in Seminole County, there had been this crisis of hungry kids. It had made national news on 60 Minutes. And I wanted to do something about that. And that was a big driver in what I was doing. And David not only helped me understand that, but as I came to know David, I appreciated very much his concern for our community and the well-being of our community as well.
Well, it could have gone in a lot of different ways. And speaking of helping hungry kids, we're actually doing the service project.
I love that.
So that's a good tie-in to our similar interests. But we're in a place of friendship now, and we're seeking opportunities to get together. We were introduced by a mutual friend in the interfaith circles in Central Florida that we both travel within, and we had a chance to learn from one another and to realize what I realize every time I get off the internet and have a coffee with somebody. Unless they're Mormon, and then it's not coffee. But, you know, that's beside the point. We get together, and we talk about the things that we agree on. And I do that with some of my best friends are members of clergy, which is the serious joke that I often tell, because the Interfaith Council of Central Florida has been very welcoming to me and to humanism and to our efforts in the Central Florida Free Thought community. I'm the secretary on the board of directors of the Interfaith Council. And we're not talking about changing the name yet, so maybe one day. But it's really developed into a friendship, and this is the first opportunity we've had to do something more than break bread together, but I'm sure there'll be more.
That's a joke that often David uses when we get together. Let's break bread together.
Oh, is that religious? Is that what you're talking about? Okay. Because atheists don't eat, right? Is that a Christian value, eating together? Is that what you're saying? Sorry, we didn't practice that
Things
joke.
are human, right?
So I think that we disagree on some theological issues. We have irreconcilable differences, but the things that we do agree on, we will work on together, for sure.
Absolutely. Sometimes we're glad that no one's watching our conversations, that we meet at Panera, and sometimes we wish that they were, because there's something that happens within the relationship that puts down all the noise from outside and allows us to understand. And I'm a better person of faith because of the challenges that David offers me. And I hope that in some way, as we go back and forth, that's strengthening and helpful to you as well.
Absolutely. And I think one day we might be able to have theological discussions in public, but for now we'll stick to the stuff we agree on, I think. But we can always joke about the theological stuff. So it's with that spirit in mind and discovering overlapping values and learning about the common ground that we have that is sorely needed today. And with that spirit, we invite you to listen and participate today, and with questions as well. We don't expect this debate to change anyone's mind on theology, but we hope that through the debate and the conversations that we'll have, we can further develop some understanding of each other's perspectives and model discourse that we'd like to see more of. And it really does mean meeting one another, because we don't really figure stuff out on Facebook very often, right?
That's right.
Thanks for being here, Andy, and with that, I'll introduce our debater. So we'll come back up afterwards.
Thank you.
So we'll introduce our special guests who will debate the question, does God exist? And for the affirmative position, we have Dr. Adam Lloyd Johnson. He earned his PhD in theological studies with an emphasis in philosophy of religion at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He serves the university campus ministry Ratio Christi and teaches at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and travels annually to teach at Rhineland Theological Seminary in Wilmersdorf, England, or Germany, rather. So welcome, Adam. And I have to say the obligatory, make sure you correct me on how I mispronounce that later. And for the negative position, we have Dan Barker. As most of you know, Dan is co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He became an evangelist at the age of 15 and preached for 19 years before he became unconvinced that God exists. He often says, "I just lost faith in faith." As an accomplished author, public speaker, and debater, he has seen his share of microphones, cameras, and lecterns, and he returns as a previous FREEFLO guest from all the way back in 2015. Our abbreviated debate format will be described in a moment, but welcome with me, Dan Barker. All right, so the format will be as follows. We'll have 15-minute opening statements beginning with Adam. That'll be immediately followed by 10 minutes of rebuttal beginning with Dan. After that, we'll have 4 or 5 audience questions depending upon how succinct you are and how succinct they are. So we're going to work for succinctness today. And at 5 p.m. sharp or so, we'll stop at the questions so that Adam and Dan can each have a 4-minute closing. We'll see how the time goes. We're not going to shorten any of their guaranteed time. We may shorten the questions or go a little bit over. For the questions, there are many ways to do it. I know you will all have opinions. Some of you will text me that we did it wrong, and I appreciate that. We considered technology. We considered stone tablets. We considered all kinds of ways to get the questions up here. But we've decided that jotting those down on a card will make it most functional for the brief format today. All right, so 2 volunteers or more, depending on how many people we could scrounge up to help with this noble cause. They will pass a card to you if you just raise your hand and let them know you have a question. If you have a question now, I'm sure you're wrong about that, so give it a few minutes. Let's hear what they have to say, and if you would just raise your hand, someone will send a pencil and a card down, and if you'll help us get those to the people with their hand up, that will be great, because they may not be able to keep their hand up that long. So thank you so much. We will begin in just a moment. Andy and I will be back up after to have a quick conversation before we go to break before dinner, so give me a second to set up. Adam, as soon as you're ready and as soon as I'm ready, you can start, and we'll start the timer.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dan, and I want to thank all of you for letting me speak at your conference. Now, you might not recognize me without my Freddy Krueger costume that I had on last night. I wore that because I understand there's a sense in which I'm the enemy here. But I tell you, nobody has treated me like an enemy, so thank you for that. I'm inspired by David and Andy's friendship as I've heard about it over the last few months and their vision to have this debate where we can provide an example of how to disagree on something very serious, but in a respectful way. Seems like something our culture has forgotten how to do. One of the reasons that they chose me for this debate is I, like them, want to engage with people that I disagree with in a friendly way. Not to combat with them as with an enemy, but more to appeal to them as a friend, to truly listen. The atheist that I interact with the most is an atheist philosopher by the name of Eric Wielenberg. Though we disagree, we write against each other, our positions, we respect each other, and I would say have become friends over the years. We go out to eat, we speak at conferences together, we wrote a book together. I brought him to the University of Nebraska where we had a debate there. He even wrote, this blows my mind, he even wrote an endorsement for my next book, like what will go on the back cover of the book. He wrote an endorsement for my next book, even though the book is mostly arguing against his atheistic theory. Well, in this debate, I'm arguing for mere theism, that there is a God. So I'm not going to be arguing for Christianity or the Bible, only that there is a supreme being. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my journey when it comes to belief in God. I grew up in rural Nebraska, where most everybody seemed to believe in God, though nobody ever talked about him. And so when I grew up and went to university, I had wondered if maybe when I go to university, what I'll find there is that the most educated folks, the professors, would all be atheists. And it was just us rural farmers, us rural Nebraska folk that believed in God. When I went to university, first in my family to do so, I did have some professors who were atheists, but I also had some professors who were theists. On the first day of astronomy, Dr. Gaskell, after he explained his academic credentials, he told us that the most important thing he had found in his research is God. For philosophy, I had world-famous philosopher Robert Oddie, who's been well known in the field of epistemology and moral intuitionism. He's been president of the American Philosophical Association and president of the Society of Christian Philosophers. So I realized that there are very intellectual, educated people who believe in God and many educated people, intelligent, who don't believe in God. I knew even in college that it's not a good reason to believe in something just because there are some smart people who also believe it. So I wanted to dive into this topic. I really wanted to understand why different people believed in God and why others didn't. At first, all I could find was stuff at the popular level, what today is mostly on the internet, basically garbage, just bad arguments, right, for God, bad arguments against God. Atheist and theist, mostly just making fun of each other, attacking character instead of arguments, not really listening to each other, just making the overly bold, confident claims, straw men, rattling off 100 things just to make their opponent look silly instead of dealing with the best arguments. But thankfully, as I continued researching and thinking about this belief, I eventually found a community where atheists and theists work together in this field, listen to each other, and deal with the best arguments for and against God. I was so thankful to find a community like that, and as you might have guessed, that community that I'm talking about is philosophy of religion, and the philosophy of religion departments at universities all across the country. I wanted to join and be a part of that community, so I worked on my PhD in philosophy of religion and enjoyed studying the best arguments for and against the existence of God. Now I'd like to share with you why I believe that there is a God. Now, one of the things I'm fascinated by is that many different thinkers around the world throughout history have independently concluded that there is a God. They use different terms for their idea of a supreme being, but their descriptions of a supreme being are remarkably similar. For example, many of these thinkers throughout history around the world describe this supreme being as spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, creator of everything, intelligent, and the source of morality. It's not a coincidence that they came to these similar conclusions because they arrived at them through a similar thought process. That is, by observing and reflecting upon the world around them. This similar thought process I'm talking about are these three theistic type of arguments, which arrive at similar conclusions about what this supreme being is like. The three arguments I'm talking about are first cause arguments, design arguments, and moral arguments. This book documents how these arguments can be found around the world throughout history by different thinkers. I'll just give you a few examples. You're probably familiar with Plato. He argued that from the motion of the stars and all the things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe, he concluded there's a best soul, a maker and father of all, the king. Similarly, Aristotle argued that there's a first unmoved mover, a living, intelligent, immaterial, eternal, most good being who is the source of order in the cosmos. Not just Western thinkers either. Eastern philosophers throughout history have made similar arguments. I love the title of this book. This Hindu thinker, A Handful of Flowers of Logic, he gives 8 arguments for the existence of God, the first 4 of which are first cause arguments. More recently, Gandhi published several articles arguing for the existence of God, first cause arguments, design arguments, and moral arguments. He wrote, for example, there is an orderliness in the universe. There is an unalterable law. That law, then, which governs all of life is God. Law and lawgiver are one. Now I'm going to give you some contemporary versions of these arguments. I'll be brief, but here is a resource that I often give people that gets more into the nitty-gritty, more of the scientific details behind these arguments. It's written by Stephen Barr, physics professor at the University of Delaware, and I give this out often because it covers more of the scientific details behind the arguments. The first argument that I'm going to cover is a contemporary version of the first cause argument. So here it goes, just a nutshell, basic version of it. Premise 1, whatever has a beginning must have a cause. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. A contemporary advocate of this argument is Dr. Robert Kuhn's philosophy professor at the University of Texas, if you want to dig down deeper into this argument. I'm just giving the bare nutshell version today. Now, you might notice with this argument, a lot of people notice, I thought this was an argument for God. It doesn't end with God, it just ends with a cause. Why do people think this cause is God? Well, many thinkers have concluded that the best explanation for this cause is some sort of a supreme being through abductive reasoning, through reasoning like an inference to the best explanation. Similarly, that's how we often think through things. A lot of possibilities, some effect that we see, something happen, we think through, there's all sorts of possibilities of what that could be, but what's the best explanation of it? That's the abductive reasoning that I'll be using. For example, Since the universe itself, the universe, just is space, time, and matter, then those things didn't exist until the universe began. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude that this cause, which existed prior to space, time, and matter, is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Also, I think it's reasonable to conclude this cause is very powerful, since he brought the universe into existence. Moving on quickly now, I know this is going to have to be brief, but here's a basic version of the design argument. Sometimes it's called the fine-tuning argument. The first premise says we've only ever seen design come from an intelligent mind. Premise 2, the universe has evidence of design. This is that fine-tuning, why it's called that. Therefore, the universe was designed by an intelligent mind. A contemporary proponent of design arguments is Francis Collins. I would recommend his book there, The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. He is a geneticist and was part of the leadership group who mapped out the human genome and was highly praised and awarded by our President, Barack Obama. Well, many atheists, including Christopher Hitchens, agree that this fine-tuning argument is the strongest argument for God. Premise 1 is based on empirical observation. We've just never seen design come from any other source except from an intelligent mind. And so when we see elements of design in the universe, I think it's reasonable to conclude that it came from some sort of intelligent mind analogous to ours. So from this argument, many have concluded that this first cause is also intelligent. Now lastly, the third argument then is the one that I specialize in, the moral argument for God. Here's just a basic version. Premise 1, there are objective moral truths independent of our minds. Premise 2, the existence of God is the best explanation for how there could be objective moral truths. Therefore, God exists. A contemporary proponent of this argument is Robert Adams. He's been a philosophy professor at Oxford and Yale, Rutgers, and I believe at University of California. Like Plato, Adams argues that God is the best explanation of objective morality in the sense that God provides the ultimate moral standard, a moral yardstick, if you will, such that other things are good and we can measure the goodness of other things by comparing them to God, and if they resemble Him in a morally pertinent sense, then they are good. For premise 1, just walk with me through this argument with my last couple minutes here. For premise 1, consider two statements. So consider these two statements. The first statement is, green is my favorite color. The second statement is 2 + 2 = 4. Now, if we all took some pills today, some mad scientist put something in our drinking water, or he gave us pills so that we woke up tomorrow believing that blue was our favorite color. All of us thought that blue was our favorite color. And we also all thought that 2 + 2 = 5. Somehow he gave us those pills to think that, and we woke up tomorrow thinking that. Now, consider with me tomorrow, would my belief that blue is my favorite color be true? I think it would, because a belief like that is dependent on my mind. Green used to be my favorite color, but now tomorrow it's blue because of that mad scientist and the pill he had me take. That's a belief that's dependent on my mind. But what about the belief 2 + 2 = 5? He gave me a pill to think that tomorrow, but is that true? If all of us tomorrow believed that 2 + 2 = 5, would that make it true? And I think the answer is no. And the reason is because 2 + 2 = 4 is an objective truth, a mathematical truth that exists in a sense beyond our minds. Similarly, ask yourself a question about this third statement. This third statement, it's wrong to abuse women. That statement, it's wrong to abuse women, is that more like my favorite color is green? Or is that more like 2 + 2 = 4? In other words, if somebody gave me a pill, all of us a pill, and we woke up tomorrow morning, all of us thinking, because of that mad scientist, that it was morally okay to abuse women, would that make it morally okay to abuse women? And I would say no. I think we would agree. That seems to be more like the mathematical truth, that it's objectively wrong. It's a truth independent of our minds and what we think, that it's objectively true that women should not be abused.
All right, thank you for that opening. And Dan? Get ready. Thanks for that again, and just remember, raise your hand if you have a question. You may be thinking that you have one now, and now is the time, because you've heard, at least one of these guys. So Dan, whenever you're ready, I will start the clock. 15 minutes, sir.
Thank you, David. Hello. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Add 4 seconds to the clock.
Restarting.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, FREEFLO. This has been really a fun time getting to know and meet all of you. And thank you, Adam, for agreeing to do this. You're very brave. I think I know something of what you might be feeling, because I've done a lot of debates in churches, sometimes with more than 1,000 people, and I felt like Daniel in the lion's den sometimes. But here you're more like Adam in the garden, I think. You're among friends here, so... a long time ago, I stopped being nervous at debates. I have to say, I've done so many that it's just like, this is just fun. But today's different. Not because of Adam. Adam's a great guy. He's articulate, he's intelligent, he's gentle. And not because of the topic, because we've covered this a lot, but because of the audience. There are people in this audience who should be up here instead of me, I think. Seth Andrews is here. Where's Seth? Seth is here. My goodness. And Matt Dillahunty. And many others of you who have done this thing for a living for a long time. So I would simply ask if you please be gentle, okay? Most of you know my story. I was a preacher, a true believing preacher. I believed in God. I preached for 19 years, and I changed my mind. I like to say I didn't throw out the bathwater. I threw the bathwater out. I found out there's no baby in the bathwater. So I was one of those kind of preachers that you would not have wanted to sit next to on a bus, because I was so sure Jesus was coming soon. The Bible is reliable. God is real. I got the goosebumps. I got the feelings. But more than that, I had what I thought was the rock truth of the reliability of Scriptures. I did change my mind. You can see, if you want to know more of my story, you can read it in my book, Godless, in the back. So from my point of view, this debate's easy, because the atheist has nothing to prove. Atheism is simply the absence of theism. So I don't have to get up here and a whole bunch of talking points to prove that there is no God. Annie Lorraine and I, the first time we visited Iceland, it was really a beautiful country. We took a tour of the country, just gorgeous scenery. We were driving along this highway. They call it a highway, it's a road. And there was a place where the road was going straight, and then it veered like this, kind of around and made it like a semicircle, and then went straight again, like it was avoiding something. The driver told us it was in fact avoiding something. It was avoiding elves. There are people in Iceland who still believe in elves, and the government accommodated this belief by diverting the highway so that it wouldn't disturb where some people thought these elves actually lived in the history. And I thought, well, that's cute. This is local culture. This is, it's a free country. People can believe what they want. If someone wants to believe in elves, fine. But what if one of the elf people, what would you call an elf believer? An elvist? A theist, elvist? What if one of them says, but it's true, Dan. You have to believe in the elves. And I would say, well, that's fine for you. You can believe that. But I have good reason for believing in these elves. I really do. And I said, well, that's okay. I'm fine. You can have your belief. That's fine with me. But you need to believe it, because the ancient elf thousands of years ago was killed, and then he came back to life. And if you don't believe in him, you're going to be punished. And then I'm thinking, well, that is maybe not so cute anymore, but that's your belief, right? So give me some reason why. Why are there really elves there where the highway bends? Give me some reasons. And what if the Elvis were to turn to me and say, no, you have to prove that there are no elves? Is that the way to argue? Who has the burden of proof? The burden of proof beyond any reasonable doubt, and even Adam admits there's reasonable doubt because he's met many of the philosophers of religion who have reasonable doubt about the existence of the great elf, the great theist. And so all I have to do today is demonstrate that he, as sincere as he is and as smart as he is, has failed to make a case beyond a reasonable doubt. Most atheists will say, in general, that not that God has been disproved, but that God is unproved, and that we are open to changing our mind. I would love to know if there's really elves. I would love to know if there's really a God. That would be an amazing thing to know. So bring it on. Let's hear what you have here. Atheism is simply the absence of theism, although there's a subset of what you might call hard atheists who say they believe or know there's no God. Most of us atheists and agnostics simply lack a belief, and I think it's based on generally 6 lacks or 6 absences. The first one is the absence of a coherent definition of a God. You heard earlier that God is somehow defined as what did he call him? A timeless, immaterial, spaceless being. What does that mean? What's the coherency between, we know what a being is. A being is an agency that occupies space and time. A being can be measured and can be weighed. We know what beings are. How can you take that word being and then apply it to something that's non-being? To be means to exist in space and time, and yet they're defining this creature as a spaceless, timeless space-time thing. That's not coherent. There are a lot of other reasons why the definitions of different gods, and there's many different definitions, fall flat, and we can't even debate their existence because we don't even know what we're talking about. It would be like arguing for the existence of a married bachelor. Should we have a debate for a married bachelor? No, you don't even get off the ground. We don't even know what we're talking about. There are many mutually incompatible properties in these definitions of these gods that have been proposed to us, and some of them cancel each other out, especially the omni-gods. A lot of these omnis cancel each other out. The Christian God traditionally is defined as a being who is a personal being, who is omniscient, who is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Let me get some water here. And yet those characteristics cannot exist logically. It's like a married bachelor. My favorite one is what I call FANG, the free will argument for the non-existence of God. If God is a person who has free will, regardless of what you think about humans. We're all debating about whether humans have free will or not. Atheists disagree. Theologians disagree. Philosophers and scientists disagree about whether we humans have free will, and we can have that debate some other time. But certainly most theists believe that God himself does have free will. He's a personal being who can make choices. But in order to have free will, you have to have options. You have to have a period of uncertainty where it's not strawberry or vanilla yet, or chocolate yet. I'm still going to decide. You have to have a period of uncertainty during which you can make your decision. But if God knows the future, including his own future, he has no period of uncertainty. There is no phase in there where he's able to exercise a decision because he knows what he is going to do in the future. So if you know the future, you cannot have free will. That doesn't mean there's not some other kind of God that could be modeled by tinkering with definitions, and theologians have tried different ways of doing that. And, of course, many of these definitions are not falsifiable. What is it that would actually prove your God hypothesis to be false? We rarely hear anyone give an example of a statement which, if true, would make that original hypothesis false. The second lack is I think it's the biggest one, the lack of evidence. The Elvis might say, well, yeah, I have evidence. There's stories about elves. There's songs about elves. There's books and there's sagas about elves. Have you ever eaten a box of Lucky Charms? There's a leprechaun on the front. There's pictures of elves. And I would say, well, okay, that's evidence, but is that good evidence? I mean, really, would anyone think that was good evidence? It's more evidence of culture and myth-making, more evidence of human wishful thinking to explain the world. But think about this. If there really was evidence, good evidence for a God, by now, someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Any scientist in the world would jump at that, wouldn't they? If there was solid evidence of the existence of a hitherto unknown force in the cosmos, then someone should have done that, and they haven't yet. So that's an absence. I'm not saying this disproves God, but it's a lack. It's an absence of God. And in fact, Exhibit 1 in this plank is this debate right now. If God exists, why are we arguing for him? If God exists, why are we debating for his existence? Why are we falling back on words and abductive reasoning to try to get to the... If there's a God, it seems pretty puny, doesn't he? That he needs philosophers to come up with arguments for his existence. I mean, this doesn't disprove the arguments, but it does kind of show that this being is kind of hiding himself. And if he really is going to all this trouble to hide himself, what business do you have to try to expose him? You know what I mean? He's doing a good job of hiding himself, and you're trying to bring, come on, God, come on out. So this debate itself is an argument for the lack of evidence. There's also a lack of good argument. And during my rebuttal, I'll talk about the three major planks that Adam brought up. The design argument is kind of like the guy who's so surprised. How did they get all those rivers to flow right along the state borders? How did they do that? Look at that. That must have been a massive feat of engineering and public expense to do that. That's proof of something, right? How did they do? Or like Julia Sweeney says in her movie, Letting Go of God, look at the human nose. Look at how perfectly built it is to support a pair of glasses. Look at that. How do you explain that unless there's some intelligent design here? Well, there needs to be a word for this. It's not really a fallacy, but it's like when your premise is backwards. When you think that the rivers, the state borders came first and the rivers came later. It's like Vic Stenger, he wrote the book, The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning. He's an astrophysicist. He just died recently. Vic Stenger said, the universe is not fine-tuned for us. We are fine-tuned for the universe. And yet, there's a fallacy that happens in the making of your premise that somehow this design is evidence when it's a backwards kind of inside-out thinking. I think we need a new word. We have deductive logic, which is pretty powerful for formulating hypotheses that are solid conclusions. We have inductive logic, which is pretty good, it's weaker for generating some premises. We have what Adam called abductive logic, which really is just a fancy word for your best guess. And that's okay when you're trying to solve a crime. You're looking for a prime suspect. Actually, prime suspects are people who do exist, right? But I think we need another kind of a word called maybe postductive logic, where it's kind of like the post hoc fallacy. The rooster crows every morning and the sun comes up. Wow, powerful rooster, right? Wow. Of course, we all see the illogic of that. Well, Adam is making the same mistakes when he's talking about fine-tuning. He's assuming a certain temporal causality here, even with the so-called formation of the Big Bang, admitting that space and time came into existence at the Big Bang, and yet saying something must have come prior. How can you describe prior to time? Time is a dimension. What is higher than height? What is broader than width? It's a dimension that we're talking about, and yet Adam seems to be talking about them as if they were things, as if time somehow could exist outside of time, which is not a coherent concept. There's other problems with some of these arguments, and most of them fall into what we would call God of the gaps. We can't explain something, the appearance of fine-tuning. We can't explain that so well, then God seems to be... Conveniently, the God that I was raised with seems to be the right answer to plug that gap. When we know through history that science has been plugging those gaps all along. What caused the thunder? They didn't know. It must have been some agency, some big being called Zeus or Thor or something up there. We don't know. Well, now we do know something about electricity and about the weather. That gap is closed. It was open for a while. People were free to plug it with their God. There are some gaps that exist in science right now. We admit it. There are many unanswered questions. Why is the cosmological constant so razor-thin perfect in our universe right now? Why is it so close to zero? Could it have been some other number? And then, of course, another lack, the fourth lack, is the lack of agreement. Theists, people who believe in God, don't agree with each other. about the nature of this God. They argue with each other. They don't agree with each other about moral principles. Adam mentioned morality, and yet you take any moral issue of the world right now that we're struggling with. What would it be? Gay marriage or abortion rights or the war or gun control, or you could name another dozen issues that are very important. You find good, Bible-believing, church-going Christians on both sides of those issues, don't you? There's no moral guidance in the Bible, except some general, do good. But if the Bible's a moral guidance, and I know we're just talking about mere theism here, but still, we look at the theists themselves and we see if there's a God, why isn't there just one religion?
1 minute.
Why? Why shouldn't there be more? I mean, why should there be just one religion alone? And then, of course, the final absence is the lack of a need for a God. I'll come back to the problem of evil in a moment. Millions of good people, tens of millions of good people in this country and hundreds of millions of good people in the world live happy, meaningful, productive, moral, purposeful lives without believing in a God. We march in the same march with believers as well. In the real world, we know how to live a moral life through the intention of avoiding harm in the real world. There are no objective moral values. That's an oxymoron, and I'll talk about that later during my rebuttal. So based on that, and then I'll throw in the problem of evil in a minute, it is justifiable. It's not proof, but it is justifiable not to hold a belief in a God.
Thank you, Dan. We'll come back to you for your rebuttal in just a moment if you want to reset yourself. I just need another 30 seconds here to let folks know. I think we're doing pretty good with getting questions back. If you've got, go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question after Dan's talk, and we'll get into the rebuttal here shortly. And we're going to compile those, sort through them, and pick the ones we like the best. That's just what you do, But we want to balance the questions. We have an imbalanced audience, so we may have an imbalance of questions. So we're going to balance the questions. We're going to make sure we can read them. We're going to make sure it's not your lunch order for tomorrow that you accidentally handed in, and then we'll do that. So, Dan, are you close?
I spilled some water here. Does somebody have a paper towel or something on
Yep,
the
we'll
floor?
get you one right up there.
So I won't be...
Okay, ready when you are. Quit stalling now. You start, and I'll start the timer.
Oh, here's some towels. Hold on.
Thank you for that. How about a round of applause for the paper towels? You said you needed a lot of water. Now I know why.
I think that'll work. Thanks for that. You will have a great reward in heaven for that.
Never gets old. Never gets old. Okay, Dan, when you start talking, I'll start timing, but you can't keep delaying like this. It's just unfair.
All right. Okay, so fine-tuning, by the way, which assumes the facts of physics, and which if there is fine-tuning, it's we who are being fine-tuned by natural selection to survive in this universe. But if there is fine-tuning, then it's assuming the facts of an old universe, and I assume then it assumes the truth of evolution, because that's how we got where we are, through the chemical processes and through carbon in stars and all of that. So I would like to ask you, Adam, later when you get a chance to reply, for a better definition of a God, not just some spaceless, timeless. In the Old Testament, God had a body. He had a face, he had hands. Moses was told not to look at his face. You can look at my backside. What was Moses actually looking at? When he was looking at the backside of God, was there something physical there? Of course, modern Christians have sort of, turned God into a immaterial thing, whereas in the ancient times, of course, they believed God was an actual being. There's a book out called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who points that out. So please give us a better definition of what this being is, not just some best guess. So when I talked about fine-tuning, if there's a God, why would he need to tune anything? I mean, why would he need to fine-tune? It looks like God has stumbled onto this scene where there's all this randomness, and he goes, oh, I'm going to have to tune this, I'm going to have to tune that, and pretty soon I'm going to make it so that human beings, which are the most special thing in the universe, besides me, human beings can exist. I'm tuning this dial and this dial. Victor Stenger, whom I talked about earlier, pointed out that, yes, it is true that if you did turn this one dial by the smallest amount, well, then life would not be permitted. But he showed that there's more than one dial. You could adjust this constant, and forgive me for not remembering the exact constants, but then if you adjust this one this way, like riding a bicycle, you could stay in balance. There are many other ways that life-permitting universes could exist without being in this exact universe that we're in. It may be different from ours, and it may evolve through natural selection in a different way, but it doesn't. What he does is he doesn't say there's just one denominator to the probabilities. If you take these huge numbers they give, the probability of one of these constants being off, it assumes that the numerator is just 1. And so if you're going to make an argument from abductive reasoning for the existence of something that we don't know about, but that you're going to propose as a prime suspect, then why can't I use the same abductive reasoning to say, well, then this justifies the hypothesis of a multiverse? You know, there may be ways to confirm a multiverse, but right now, if we can use your same reasoning, we could argue that, well, a multiverse is a good example. Let me tell you a story. You're convicted of a horrible crime. You're blindfolded, you're tied to a stake, and you're being told that you're going to be executed by 100 expert shooters. And you hear, ready, aim, fire, and you hear the crack of 100 rifles, but you're still there. Do you just go, oh, I guess I was lucky? That calls out for some kind of explanation, doesn't it? Did a wind come along and blow the bullet? Or did they actually all miss at the same time? Or you could think of a number of prime suspects. You could think of a number of possibilities. What's the best explanation? Well, maybe they all like me and they missed on purpose. That would be one explanation. That may be more like a theistic explanation. But what if you took off your blindfold and looked around and you learned that there were 101 prisoners being executed that day? None of them missed. You happened to be that one out of 101. Whoever it was would be the one standing there going, I'm here. Is it luck? Well, yeah. So if that number in the numerator is higher than the number in the denominator when you're calculating your probabilities, then you have a near certainty. In fact, then how do you know that the numerator is not orders of magnitude larger than that? And it doesn't even have to be some weird kind of multiverse. It could just be different pockets within our own cosmos where the laws are slightly different, in which case any observer, sometimes you call this the weak anthropic principle, any observer obviously is going to exist in a universe that permits observers to exist. I mean, that's just pretty clear. A universe with a God, a fine-tuning would look the same in a universe with a God as it looks without a God. So it doesn't get you anywhere. The moral argument, I guess we're running out of time here, aren't we? There are no objective moral values. That's an oxymoron. That's wrong. Because a value is a function of a brain. It's a concept, right? So to be objective is to exist independent of a brain. So how can you have a value that's a part of the brain exist outside of the brain as an objective thing? What you're doing is you're reifying a concept. The concept of moral values, you're turning that into a thing that somehow exists objectively. I will say, and I think most atheists in this room will say, that most of our moral values can be objectively verified. Just like you can objectively verify that 2 + 2 = 4, get 2 apples and put them together, and you can do that. So we have values that we choose, not because they exist from outside the universe, because of the way we bump into each other in this natural biological world where harm is caused often. And these values that we have in our mind exist in our mind. And to say that they are objective outside of the mind is to beg the question. You're assuming some realm, some transcendent entity somewhere that's above and beyond space-time, above and beyond nature, some realm where these things exist. That's like a Platonic thing. You quoted Plato earlier. And yet, most of my friends, atheist friends, refuse to reify concepts into things and treat a concept as what it is. It's part of a functioning mind. That would be like saying, what happens to the soul when the body dies? Well, couldn't we also ask, What happens to digestion when the stomach dies? Where does the digestion go? Does it live in another realm somewhere? And why is it that when I walk across the stage, my digestion follows my stomach, right? So the brain is also a bodily organ, and it's functioning, and it has things that we call values. That it's a higher level. It would be more like an emergent, not even a property, but an emergent thing we describe as the values that we use to get through life. But it only works in a functioning mind. If I walk across the stage, isn't it weird that my soul is following my cranium? How does that, what's tethering it there? Obviously, it's wrong to think of a soul or a digestion or a functioning or a label for something that's working. It's wrong to think of that as a thing that needs to be explained in some way. We explain it only when the organism is functioning. Morality simply boils down to the intention to act with the minimal amount of harm in the real world. That's what we mean by morality. If you're going to judge a religion as good or bad, what are you using to judge it with? Real world stuff. Does it harm women? Does it encourage slavery? Does it, you're using actual physical, real things to measure, objectively measure whether these values you have are worth holding on to. If they're not, you discard these values and they no longer cease to exist in a real or imagined world. So, harm, I think you can boil down morality in one word, and that's the word harm. I know there are other philosophers, and some atheist philosophers might disagree with me. There's other ways of articulating morality. But I think basically, if we look at what the harm is, and harm, whatever harm is, you can probably make a list of 100 things that you would say are harmful. Whatever it is, it's natural, it's material. Even psychological harm has natural material because it's harming a living organism. And if you're acting with the intention of minimizing real harm in the real world, you are acting morally, because that's what we mean by morality. And I guess I would invite you to just define the word morality, too, before you use the word. But how would you define morality? Is it following God's rules? That's what morality is? Or is morality using your mind to see if there is some real-world objective basis for these conclusions that you have in your mind? So the moral principle doesn't get us anywhere. The fine-tuning argument, it might give us a suspect, an imaginary suspect, but it doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't get to the elves under the ground. It just gives you permission to consider that there might be some suspect out there who would answer your questions. And the cosmological argument, I think, begs the question. Because when you use that phrase, everything that begins to exist, you're arbitrarily dividing reality into two groups. Things that do begin to exist and things that don't begin to exist. Where did you get that from? Where did you get the idea that there would be such things that don't exist, start to exist, so that we could even make the phrase things that do begin to exist? We have no concept or no knowledge of things that do not begin to exist. And if you think that's what God is, then you are importing your conclusion into your premise, which is called begging the question. So the Kalam argument, for many other reasons, begs the question, compares apples and oranges, and actually doesn't get us any closer to any real evidence for a real God.
Okay, so back to the moral argument. This is what I specialize in, and I didn't get a chance to share my last slide here. And there's more and more atheist philosophers that are affirming that there are objective moral truths. Now, obviously, they're atheists, so they believe that there can be objective moral truths, even though there is no God. But these are the atheists that I'm very interested in interacting with. Here's a list of them, and then Eric Wielenberg is the one that I write most, and we wrote that book together. He wrote the endorsement for my next book coming out. So many atheist philosophers are now affirming that there are these objective moral truths, just like there's objective mathematical truths. Then the question becomes, what's the best explanation for these moral truths? Where do they come from? How can they exist? And that's where the moral argument, people like Robert Adams and myself argue that God's the best explanation for them. All right, let me respond as quickly as I can to a lot of the things. Dan brought up a lot of good issues, and I'll try to respond as quickly as I can to them. So let's talk about God of the gaps for a moment. Now, gap arguments are poor arguments, and we all have to be careful to avoid them. It's a mistake when we have a gap in our knowledge to say that it must be God. Some theists have made that mistake. And a lot of things that people used to think were caused by God, we've now learned, like he said, have natural explanations. However, that doesn't mean that everything has a natural cause. It's also a mistake when we have a gap in our knowledge to say that there must be a natural cause. That would be a natural causes of the gaps. No, what we need to do is evaluate each situation and try to figure out what's the best explanation for what we're seeing, the effect that we're seeing. That's what these arguments for God are, the ones that I presented. They start with things that we observe or experience, the beginning of the universe, design, morality, and then through abductive reasoning conclude that God is the best explanation for these things. Dan seems to dismiss any argument for God as a God of the gaps. And so I would like to hear from Dan an argument for God that he wouldn't consider a God of the gaps argument. In terms of fine-tuning, let me just, for sake of time, recommend one resource for you, relatively new resource. It's written by a gentleman, Luke Barnes. He got his PhD from Cambridge, and this was published by Cambridge University Press. It's a book on fine-tuning, A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos. Now, this science is very engaging. If you like science, this is great stuff to dive into. I specialize in the moral argument, but I really respect these folks that dive into more of these scientific arguments. The hiddenness of God. Now, I agree at times that God feels hidden, okay? I agree with that. Sometimes I wish there were more evidence for God. Obviously, the more evidence, the better. But I think there is a lot of good evidence for God, good evidence and reasons to believe in God, such as the arguments that I presented. These arguments start with evidence, effects we see, and then propose God as the best explanation for the cause of these things. And there might be good reasons why God doesn't give us more evidence. For example, God might know, I'm speculating here, but for example, God may know that if he revealed himself more, it wouldn't make any difference, that those who reject him with this amount of evidence would also reject him even if they had more evidence. I've heard Dan say on many occasions that he would reject God even if he revealed himself very obviously and directly to Dan. And if that's true, then why would God give Dan more evidence? I do want to talk about this idea of immateriality. I don't see any good reason to think that immaterial things can exist. I think a good case can be made that there are immaterial things that exist outside of space and time, like abstract objects, mathematical truths, as I've discussed, the truths of logic. Many atheists, as I've noted, claim moral truths exist outside of space and time. So the idea of an immaterial being that exists outside of space and time isn't incoherent. Many atheist philosophers like John Searle, Chalmers, Kim, they claim that our minds are material, our consciousness. They're based, on our physical brains, but what it produces is immaterial, this consciousness. So when we see the effects that our immaterial human minds can produce, like the beautiful music that Dan produces, designs with his mind, I think it's an analogous step when we see that sort of design in the universe to attribute that to a designer, possibly an immaterial mind, just like Dan's immaterial mind designs beautiful music when we see this universe, beautiful, fine-tuned for life. seems reasonable to conclude that something analogous to our minds produced it, just because we've never seen design come from any other source than an intelligent mind. I don't see why we should think immaterial things can't produce physical effects. My mind is immaterial and it produces effects in the physical world. My mind moves my body to pick something up. Dan's immaterial mind creates beautiful music. So things can be created by sheer thought, and we're just proposing that God can create a physical universe with sheer thought, like we can create music. We might not know exactly how the immaterial interacts with the physical, but I don't see why it couldn't. We don't see God directly, as he pointed out, but we see effects that point to God. There's a lot of things that we don't see directly, but we infer by seeing their effects. For example, I don't see your minds, I don't see your immaterial minds out there, but based on the effects that are producing, you moving around, talking, I infer that, in fact, you do have minds. So, another example, we don't observe historical events directly either, but we infer what happened in history from the effects and the evidence that's left behind. So if there is an immaterial being like God, we would imagine that it would leave evidence behind such like a contingent universe that's finely tuned for life. I do want to talk about the multiverse here. I think that's a very good conversation. I'm glad he brought that up. There's a lot of rich literature, so let me try to, as much as I can in my 3 minutes, talk about the multiverse. It seems a bit of a stretch in an attempt to dismiss the idea of one unobservable being who designed the universe to propose an infinite number of unobservable universes. One intelligent, powerful being seems a much more plausible explanation than an infinite amount of universes. First, I think there's more evidence for God than there is for a multiverse, but even if there is a multiverse, it still would require a first cause, unless we're willing to accept an actual infinite regress of causes. A multiverse would still seem to require fine-tuning too, that is, a universe factory that's producing fine-tuned universes seems itself to require design. The worst problem, though, with the multiverse explanation or multiverse objection is that it proves too much. It's like a multiverse of the gaps. You can explain anything away with a multiverse objection. For example, let's say hypothetically that every single day the clouds formed a message all around the world, every country, the clouds formed a message in the sky that says, "Here I am God, believe that I exist." Let's say the clouds formed that every day in the sky, different languages all around the world. Well, if that happened, with the multiverse objection, we could just say, well, you know, if there was an infinite amount of universes, then certainly everything that could happen must happen in one of those universes, and we just happen to be in the universe where that happens. You see what I'm saying? The multiverse objection is just too strong. It would dismiss any sort of potential evidence for God or anything like that. So I think the multiverse objection just accomplishes too much. The last thing I want to touch on is this issue of morality. I hope you understand that I'm not claiming that atheists can't be moral people. They can. I'm not claiming that atheists can't know morality. No, they can know moral truth. That's not my argument at all. The argument that I'm making is more metaphysical, metaethical, if you will. And that is, if there are these objective moral truths, like there are objective mathematical truths, where do these truths come from? What's the best explanation of how there can be objective moral truths? And there's theories out there. Some of the atheists that I interact with over here, they propose Platonic ideas, brute ethical facts of the universe, that they're just out there in a Platonic sense. I disagree with that. I think God is a better explanation. I propose, that's my book coming out is this fall that Eric Wielenberg is endorsing. I propose that the Trinity is the best source of, or the best explanation of objective moral truth.
And thank you to our volunteers. the card-carrying members of FREEFLO. They carried the cards. Thank you also to Andy and Jocelyn for culling those. These are great questions, but I didn't get to see all of them, so, I got the good ones here. If you want to stand at the lecterns, that would be great, because some of these are going to come to both of you, and I certainly wouldn't object if you wanted to answer a question that someone else asked or for the other person, but I would say that let's be succinct, as we agreed before we started here, to try to make sure we get a lot of questions in. So this one's for Dan. If free will is an illusion, how can we condemn the actions of those who do bad things?
I guess we talked about it briefly. It seems a little off the topic, but yes, let's not debate free will. My position is that free will is an illusion. We live in a deterministic universe, but that illusions can be good things. Depth perception is an illusion, but it's very useful to us. It helps us navigate the world that we're in, even though your two eyes are merging into one three-dimensional object. I think free will is an illusion that helps us navigate the moral, let's say the moral landscape that we're in. So, and of course, we morally judge the rightness or wrongness of behavior on the outcome. I'm a consequentialist. I think everyone has to be consequentialist. Look at the consequences. Overall, if we overall are intending to end up with less harm in the real world, then whether we have free will or not, our minds still make judgments. Even if it's deterministic, we're making deterministic judgments about moral actions. So I think free will isn't even relevant to whether or not we can still justify our moral actions, because that's how we survive.
Okay. Adam, question for you. And again, just interrupt if you want to answer the other question. Happy to hear that.
Could I
Yes, please.
just say something in response
Absolutely.
to that? Yeah, I think free will is, I'm a big believer in free will, libertarian free will. There's a friend of mine who has a similar ministry to mine called the free thinking ministry. He's kind of taken that idea and saying, free thinking, that really under theism is the best explanation for how we could have free will. And without free will, it would be difficult to even make a case that we can trust our own beliefs. And so he has an argument, it's called the free thinking argument, where he argues for God from the fact that we have free will.
Sounds like they took our word there, Dan. Free thinking, didn't they?
It's a play on that. That's why he called his ministry Free Thinking Ministry. Tim Stratton.
It has several meanings. You would be surprised how free some of the free thinkers that think we're their kind of free thinkers come to free think with us, and they're a little
But
too.
you don't have free will.
That's a little too free for some of us. Okay, so Adam, your question.
Yep.
Why would you assume that God is good?
Assume that God is good. Well, I might not make that assumption. If I'm starting at ground zero, and none of us do, right? We all are born into a culture, born into a family, and so we grow up with certain ideas, but all of us come to a certain time in our age where we reflect on those ideas we've been taught by our culture, our family, our church, whatever, and we start to reflect and think, okay, what I've been taught actually true? And that was my process, and I'm sure for many of yours, part of my journey then was to explore these things and say, hey, I've been taught my whole life that there is this God, but what's the evidence? What are the reasons that some educated people believe this? And that's what took me down this path of philosophy of religion. But God is good. I think I would make the argument that God is good in this way, that first of all, acknowledging that morality, moral truth seems to be an integral part of this reality. And I, with these other atheists, try to make a case that there are objective moral truths. And if there are objective moral truths, if that's something that's part of our reality, then you have to think, well, how could that be? How could there be objective moral truths that don't change even when we change our minds? If we all changed our mind and thought it was okay to rape women tomorrow, would that make rape wrong or rape right? No, there seems to be an objective truth. So when you think through what's the best explanation of that, this idea from other arguments for God, it makes sense that if God is the source of this universe, that he also would be the source of morality. And something being the source of morality, you would infer, like Aristotle did, that he would be the ultimate good. Plato, that God is the good. He just is the good, and everything else is measured according to that. So that's how I would work into that, drawing on a lot of the philosophy of Robert Adams and Robert Hare at Yale.
I can respond just briefly. Rape is bad because it's harmful, and harm is something we can measure. And that's what we mean by good. We're avoiding that harm, and that's measurable. We can see it. We don't need an edict. And if you're talking about the God of the Bible, I know you're talking about mere theism. The God of the Bible is supremely immoral and harmful and ugly. He's genocidal, he's infanticidal, he's pestilential, he's angry, he's jealous. If you read the words of the Bible itself, and I know you're a Christian theist, so you tend to love that being, he actually took credit for raping women in the book of Jeremiah. He actually said you should be happy to dash babies against the stones. So if we're talking about morality, let's judge it in the objective world and look at the actions and the words of that being that you claim to worship, and then you tell me that that is a good God. Not because he says he is or because you have an argument, but because of his actions and his word. I never did say that if I met God, I would reject him. I never said that. I said I would reject his morality. If I met God, I would have to accept it, right? But it doesn't mean I'd have to worship him. I could tell him, you created a hell, then you go to hell. You're the one who's the criminal here, right? I can say that, can't I? And don't I have the freedom to make a moral judgment about the character of a being that I read in a book? He's not a moral being, and he's not a good God. If you're talking about the Christian God, maybe you have a different God that you worship.
So I just took Dan's next two questions and discarded them because we're done with those. But no, I do have a question for Dan, and I appreciate the passion there, and I understand that it's hard to let argument stand, and when you're having a long form conversation versus short form conversation, you can see how different that is, right? When you sit across from somebody at the coffee shop, you can have a different conversation than when you're told to talk for 10 minutes and shut up for 10 minutes, right? It is different to do that. But Dan, this one's your question. Can nothing create something?
Well, some scientists say yeah, and some say no. But before that question is even a coherent question, before you can even ask it, before you can assume that the word nothing is a thing that would or would not have the potential to create or do something, you have to define what you mean by nothing. So the word nothing means no thing, and no thing is the absence of a thing. So before you can have nothing, you have to have something. You have to have a thing that you negate, right? So the whole concept of nothing and nothingness doesn't seem like a coherent thing. So we do have some scientific examples. Right now, I know there's the energy potential of a vacuum. We would say a vacuum is completely empty, and yet right now, out of emptiness, because of quantum potential, there are occasional particles that come into existence. Matter and antimatter cancel each other out, but occasionally one of them escapes, maybe by the event horizon of a black hole or something. And so voila, in an absolutely empty vacuum, sometimes something does come from nothing.
Adam, anything on nothingness?
No, but I would like to say one thing about the Bible, if I could. Is that allowed before we move on to the next?
Sure.
Okay.
You guys get out of hand, I'll let you know.
Just two sentences. As Dan said, this debate is about the existence of God, not Christianity or the Bible. So all I'm defending is that there is a God, a supreme being. Now, the concerns that Dan raises might cause me to question the Bible, or more likely, whether Dan is interpreting the Bible correctly. But either way, they don't cause me to doubt God's existence, because my belief in God is based on the arguments I presented, not the Bible.
Okay. For Adam, if God has a plan, isn't it disrespectful to pray for him to change it?
Say it again, that went by really fast.
I know every question I have is off the topic, guys, so we could have stopped 20 minutes ago, or we could talk about these questions, so apologies. If God has a plan, isn't it disrespectful to pray for him to change it?
Okay. Well, this might be a good place to talk about, as I said before, I'm a big believer in libertarian free will. So I think we do have free will.
Can you first declare that this is not libertarianism politically, for those who don't maybe know?
Yeah, so there's different versions of free will, compatibilistic free will. Some people hold to different versions, philosophical ideas of free will. I would be one who would affirm libertarian free will, and that has nothing to do with politics. What, in a nutshell, libertarian free will, some people think of it as just being able to choose the opposite, just being able to choose otherwise. If I could choose an apple or an orange, then I have libertarian free will. A better definition of libertarian free will is that you are the cause of your actions, you are the cause of your choices. So if you have libertarian free will, then you're a causal agent. You are the ultimate cause of your choices. And I understand my theological system is referred to as Molinism. I just want to know those other jargon words, but Molinism understands how God and human free will can not contradict, that God can still be in control of the universe even though we make free will libertarian type decisions. And then this would be part of how I would explain prayer, in that God can incorporate our prayers into his plan through that process of our free choices. I might want to say something that, how much time do I get in these questions?
We're just bumping up against the top of the hour, but if you want another 30 seconds, I think that's just fine.
Okay, because I wanted to mention something that Dan was talking about with God and free will. So I don't think that omniscience and free will contradict. It's important to remember that free will isn't being able to choose otherwise, like I said. It's being the ultimate cause of your choices. So as long as the person, or in this case, God, is the ultimate source of their choices, then the choices are free, even if it was known ahead of time. Knowing something is different than causing it. Just like knowing something about the past, like that Biden chose to run for president, doesn't cause Biden to run for president, to make that decision. No, his choice to run causes my knowledge of it. Similarly, God knowing something about the future, just 5 seconds, God knowing something about the future, let's say that Kamala Harris will run for president someday, doesn't cause her to make that choice. It's still that it's her future choice causes God to know that ahead of time. But her decision is still free in the sense that she is the cause of that choice. That's how I understand free will and God's omniscience working together.
Dan, do you still want to not talk about free will?
Do I have a choice?
Under my belief system, you do.
Even the strictest determinists will say that we are the cause of our choices. Even in a strictly deterministic universe, if you need a justice system or a moral system where a criminal's on trial for committing some horrible crime, you don't go back to the Big Bang or to some, primal mover. You go to the nexus, to the organism itself. According to your definition, then a computer program is the source of the cause of the actions that it makes. So that's a totally different debate. I just wanted to say that if God knows the future, his hands are tied. He cannot do otherwise than what he chosen. So according to, I think, what most of us would judge to be a personal being who can make decisions, that kind of a being cannot make decisions because it's like a computer program that's already been scripted in advance.
So I do think we're getting a little into free will too far, but I do appreciate both of you clarifying your positions, and so thank you for that. So one more quick question, and we do want to be quick because we're at the top of the hour and we want to get your 4-minute closings in and also have a little chat with Andy again. What would change your mind? And let's start with Adam.
What would change my mind? Well, I do think all of our beliefs, and this is something that I agree with Dan, that our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence, right? I am not one of those folks who affirm or promote any sort of blind faith. Just believe something because it works, or believe something because it makes you feel good. I want to know what is true, and I want to know, and what I mean by that, I want to know what corresponds to reality. So I think all of our beliefs should be based on good reasons and evidence. Now, can we prove, I think I also agree with Dan on this, can we prove something with absolute certainty? I think the answer to that is no, maybe a few mathematical principles. And so all of our knowledge, all of our beliefs have an element of uncertainty in them. We need to do the best we can based on study, research, reasons, and evidence to make our beliefs and base them on good reasons and evidence. So, bottom line, I would change my belief if I encountered what I considered to be good reasons and evidence that there is no God.
It sounds like exactly what you're about to say, except for the opposite, right?
How did you know?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Dan.
So God is supposedly omniscient. He knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And God also promises that he will answer your prayers, and whatever you request, he will do. He says it many, many times in the Bible. Whatsoever ye shall ask for in prayer, believing, ye shall receive. You're asking me what I would accept as proof. So if you were to ask God to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, and God were to tell you, Adam, I want you to tell Dan that tomorrow at 12:14 p.m., a meteorite from the south-southwest weighing 42 pounds is going to hit the earth. It's going to go through the Navajo rug on my top floor and end up 6 inches below the basement, composed of 1% iridium and 8% iron and so on, right? If God told you that, to tell me that that's going to happen, and then it did happen tomorrow, I would take that as very strong evidence. There would be some uncertainty there, of course, but I would say, whoa, the Bible is true, that you can ask for anything. God does know the future. I mean, all of you can think of other examples of things that would change your mind. I would be happy to change my mind. If it's true, it's true, right? So far, I don't see that. So I'm not going to ask you to do that tonight, but apparently you believe in the Bible, and you believe that when you pray, in prayer believing, you shall receive what you ask for, then I would put you to the test to provide some kind of evidence like that, which then I could say, yep, I do believe. I don't know if I would worship that being, from what I know of his scriptures, that I am actually interpreting correctly, by the way. And who couldn't? I mean, really, this all-caring, all-knowing, omniscient, all-powerful God wrote a book of so much importance to the human race that we can't understand it without experts explaining to us the true context.
Let's go ahead and get back on the question. And I appreciate where this is going, and I enjoy the conversation. And it's a little more comfortable when I'm just clicking through YouTube, I have to say.
Well, if the meteorite, though, it might just be in that one universe where that happened to happen, though.
Yeah, but I would still raise the probability very high. I wouldn't put it to 100, but I think I would be convinced, especially if you told me that. I mean, the likeliness of that, I would probably say, yeah, you got something there, Adam.
But happen to be in that one universe. If everything happens in that one universe, something like that would happen.
But I'm not arguing for a multiverse, by the way.
Oh, okay.
I'm not. I said at the outset that if we're going to play your abductive reasoning game, I could play the same abductive reasoning to come up with a multiverse, which seems as likely as a prime mover.
So this is about as on track as my conversations that I have with friends. Which is fine. You're all humans that I know of, so you're doing the things that I think we all do. So thank you for all of that. I appreciate the answers to the questions, and I know our audience does as well. So Dan, you've got 4 minutes to close, and I'd like to start sooner rather than later since we're over time. Are you about ready, sir?
Yeah, maybe I can do it in less than 4.
All right.
I like Adam. He's smart, he's educated, he's articulate, and I'm, from what I know about him, a good man. I think we could be friends, maybe, unless you believe in hell. If you actually believe there's a real hell where I'm going to be tortured forever because of my choice, and you're going to be rewarded in heaven, I don't think we would ever be best friends, if that's what you think about me. But I think people should be judged by their actions. And no matter what they say, if they want to believe in elves, if they want to believe in Allah, fine, it's a free world. But people should be judged by their actions. And most Christians, most theists are good people. I think just by human nature. And just like most atheists and agnostics, we're basically good people with a few fringe people on the edge that are causing a lot of problems in every group. There's some bad Christians and there's some bad atheists in the world. So my criticisms of theism are not directed at you, Adam. And I think you understand that. You mentioned the prime mover. You said this prime mover, or whatever you call it, the cause outside of the Big Bang, or however the word you use it. You said this being has to be incredibly powerful, you said. But power is work over time. Power is a physical, natural thing. How can an immaterial being who doesn't exist in space or time, how can it have power. What would power even mean to a being? You only would say he's all-powerful if you're comparing it to something else, like he created a puny universe where he can say, look how powerful I am. It doesn't mean anything at all. So you're smuggling concepts into your premises that don't belong there, and it almost amounts to begging the question. And again, I do think moral truths can be objectively justified. I wouldn't say it in the way a lot of philosophers say it, that there exist objective moral truths, because they don't. And the brain is a functioning organism. As I said earlier, when the mind is a function of an organism, and when the brain dies, the mind is gone. And you're talking about the word mind. This audience has minds that you can infer. A mind isn't a thing. You can infer that they have brains that are functioning to some degree or another. I think in this audience, I think it's a pretty high level of functioning. But you're using the word mind as if it were a thing. You're committing that reification mistake. And therefore, here are these things that are in the universe that need some justification. These are just labels for the way things function, just like digestion or circulation of the heart. You know, when the body dies, where does the circulation go? We don't ask that question. It's a dumb question. And the same thing with minds, where does the mind go or the soul go? That's a dumb question. It's only a biological organism that has a physical, material functioning brain that produces what we would label as a mind. And for you to take that and then jump to something transcendent is a huge category mistake. So I guess I would just ask, in light of the 6 lacks or absences that I gave tonight, did Adam connect the dots? Did he do a good enough job of filling those gaps? And I don't think he did. I'm still not convinced. I'd be open to being convinced, but for now, for this reason, and we didn't even get to talk about the problem of evil, did we? Maybe another debate, we could do that. So thank you. This has been a lot of fun tonight.
Once again, I want to thank David and Andy for inviting me to this conference. I know this is your conference, but I've been very blessed to be here, and I've enjoyed hanging out with you guys last night and today as well. I want to thank Dan for having this conversation with me. We recognize that most people don't change their mind in these sort of debates. Sometimes they're just done for entertainment value. But I think they can be helpful in this regard. I think they can be an introduction to a lot of folks to these topics so that you can dive down into a more deeper understanding with books and YouTube videos and conversations. And I hope that we've modeled how you can disagree vehemently on important issues while being friendly. I think you would agree with me that that seems to have been lost in our culture right now. So let's shut Facebook off, let's shut Twitter off, and just go out to coffee and just have these conversations. And know that we're going to disagree, but still love each other in the midst of that. In this debate, I've argued for mere theism, that there is a God, a supreme being. The question isn't about whether or not we like God. Many times, I don't like God. The question is not about whether we agree with God. Sometimes I don't agree with what God does. And this debate isn't about whether or not we fully understand God. One of the things that Dan mentioned is you have theists who disagree with each other. Well, of course. It just means we don't fully understand God yet. Scientists disagree with each other about their scientific theories all the time. It doesn't mean their theory isn't true. It's just that they haven't got it figured out yet, and they're still working on it. So the fact that theists disagree among themselves, I think, makes no difference as to whether or not God exists. The issue, though, is there a God? All I've argued is that there is a supreme being who actually exists. I'm not making an emotional appeal. I'm not condemning you. I'm not using rhetoric to try to sway you. I've simply tried to provide good reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God. I'm not claiming I can do this with absolute certainty, as we've talked about, but I don't think there's anything we can prove with absolute certainty, except maybe some basic mathematical principles. So as finite beings, we're left in this area, sometimes frustrating, of trying to figure out the truth based on deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. I agree, as I said before, with Dan that we should base our belief on good reasons and evidence, and I think there are good reasons and evidence to believe in God. There's some good arguments against God. We didn't get a chance to talk about the problem of evil. We could talk more about the hiddenness of God. But at the end of the day, when I compare those arguments against God with the arguments for God, the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe, and these objective moral truths in reality, when I compare both arguments for and against God, it seems to me that the most reasonable explanation is that there is a God who created and designed the universe and who is the source of these objective moral truths. Thank you so much.
Our debaters. Check. So Andy, if you'll join me on stage, we'll finish up with yet another example of too many white men in one place at one time with the microphones. This has not gone unnoticed by us, and it has been a topic of conversation, and I can tell you that that's true. You're absolutely right. So Dan is part American Indian, so thank you for that reminder.
And I'm British, too. Does that count?
You're really white. You're really white. So, but no, seriously, though, that did not escape us, and I assure you that at FREEFLO and the Florida Humanist Association, we're trying to diversify, and we will continue to do that. And I appreciate your patience while we do that, but Andy and I's friendship was certainly out of our control, and our debaters were not completely in our control, but certainly we're glad to have Dan and Adam here, and I think they did a great job. Did Dan already leave?
Yeah, Dan,
come on back. I think that means you won. So what I think we achieved today, which was to demonstrate that that even in the debate and in conversation, we can have friendships and we can find agreement and we can find camaraderie. And I think we talked about some things that they agreed on, many things they disagreed on, but we focused on what they disagreed on. We didn't focus on what they agreed on. When we disagree more than we agree, we find ourselves, at odds. And I think we've got to make sure that we don't do that. You can always find people you disagree with on the internet, and you can always find people you agree with on the internet, and that's just binary. And I think we've got to get away from that. We've got to get out and we've got to meet people and have conversations. And I think Andy and I are starting to do that, and I hope that what we've talked about here today will inspire you to do the same. Any thoughts?
When I first met David, it was an event like this at a church with a different audience. And I heard David, it wasn't really a debate, David, it was a discussion. But I was captured by the conversation and the candor that existed, and I wanted more. This kind of debate is good for us. And so David very graciously and I got together, and we keep getting together, and I am a better person, I'm a better Christian, because David is in my life challenging me.
Amen.
Amen. I see what you did there. Did you see what he did there? I'm a big reader, reading recently a book from Simon Sinek called The Ultimate Game. And he talks about having, I've forgotten the term he uses, I wrote it down. I can't remember the term.
It's an adversary of some sort.
Yeah, an excellent rival or something like that. And that we all get better when we have these excellent rivalries in our life. And so even though David and I, in many ways, and certainly how we think and we act, are rivals, our relationship makes me better. And so when we're meeting for coffee and things like this, I've got all my faith stuff over here, and he's got all his free-thinking stuff on his side, but we come and meet in the middle.
Is that what I'm supposed to do right now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Do you want to hold arms or something?
We didn't script this too well, did we?
But it's when we can come together that we all get better, and our world needs people who can come together and talk in thoughtful, caring, helpful ways.
Yeah, once we overcome, go ahead, please. That was excellent. We should have an audience at Panera, and then we'd have to learn to wait for the applause. So getting to that point is the hard part, right? Finding someone to introduce you, finding some common ground is really a hard thing to have happen. Once we get there, though, we find out that we can agree on so much. And I wanted to take a moment and ask our debaters today, did you learn something from Adam, either up here on stage or this weekend when you were chatting with him?
So I think years ago I heard somebody make that rebuttal to the multiverse argument, and I'd forgotten about that, and that was good that you brought it up, because that is a pretty strong rebuttal. But again, I wasn't arguing for it. I was just saying, if you can play that game, so can I.
And I think we'd love, Adam, for you to give us your thoughts on anything that Dan helped you with this weekend or that you learned from him.
Yeah, and I knew it was going to come up because I've been reading your book, Mere Morality. Yep. So this idea of harm, and certainly I would agree that, when you say learn, I guess when I read it in your book and then heard it from you today, I would affirm and agree with you that our consequences and us and seeing what causes harm is definitely a way for us to know what is. It's a good epistemological tool for us knowing right and wrong from what causes harm. So that's something I would agree with.
Very good, thank you. So the reward that we get when we cross those boundaries is immeasurable, right? And you're not going to know it until you get there. Someone has to make that happen. Someone has to cross over the threshold, middle of the stage, whatever the case may be, and do that. And I hope that some of you will be inspired to do that by what you've seen today. So thank you very much for being here.